Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher.
I'm Kyle Moody.
And I'm Tim Boswell.
And this is episode 103. It's another greenhouse episode. We are going to dig into and further explore the awesome conversation that I had last episode with the incomparable Zach Leighton, a wonderful thinker and communicator, marketer, person who comes alongside churches and helps them with story. If you're new to the Soil and Roots podcast, every other episode is called a greenhouse episode. Greenhouse is a small community in which we intentionally journey together to become more like Jesus. And so the three of us get together, and that's what we try to provide you an example with. So we're every other episode go back and talk through and dig in and ask questions and further explore the content that was provided in the previous episode. And last episode was all about story. The title was called Have We Lost the Plot? The importance of story in the life of a deep disciple, both the narrative of Scripture and God's grand story, but also our individual stories, our family stories, our community stories, even our national stories. For those of you that have been listening or watching for a while, Dr. Tim Boswell's PhD is in creative literature, so I'm not sure we have a better person to help us navigate these waters than a guy who's actually been educated in it. So Tim, we're gonna let you chair this today, and love to hear your thoughts on my conversation with Zach Leighton.
I loved the conversation that you two had. It was so encouraging and enlightening to hear Zach dig into the importance of storytelling, to really have a light shown on that. And I agree 100%. Story is how we understand ourselves. It's how we understand our place in the world. It's how we come to understand God and ultimately understand the story of his son coming to rescue us and to redeem and restore the entire cosmos. So I don't think it's possible to overestimate the importance of storytelling. So I loved hearing the two of you really dig into that. When we were talking a few minutes ago, Kyle, you mentioned the question, does the church even understand what story is? You said, what does story mean to the church, and do they get that? So I want to turn that question around to the two of you. Do you think the church, at least in the West as an institution, understands story, much less recognizes how to effectively implement it into reaching unbelievers?
When I was listening to y'all's conversation, I was thinking about how important story is over these last several years that we've been together and exploring these concepts. I've seen and experienced how amazing story is, and knowing my own story and my own faults and my own struggles and my own victories and all of that. And I started thinking about in the church, was that ever an option? Did I ever experience that? And you guys talked about, you had the stories of people that had these dramatic transformations, whether it was a drug addiction or any other sort of massive kind of 180 from one previous life to the next after Jesus. And I understood all of that. But for me, it was like, well, then if I don't have that, then my story doesn't really matter. Or if I do, because I accepted Jesus at a young age. And so if I did that and I'm still struggling, or I still tend to backslide, or I do something that I know may not be right. And why would I do that if I've been saved, if I've been redeemed, if I'm being sanctified, why am I still doing these things? And so it created a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, because I wasn't familiar with how my own story worked in the context of Jesus. And so I really started thinking about, well, would the church, if I went up to any pastor at the church that I go to or went to and asked, what is the story? How important is story in church today? I mean, what would they even say? They were like, you mean the story of Jesus or the salvation story? What do you mean? And to be able to allow people to share their stories and to talk about themselves and to share and not just like some dramatic transformation, but the little things that I saw God do today or the thing over the past week. That's the thing that I love about our greenhouse is we get a chance to talk about those things that happen throughout the week. And I've never been privy to seeing or experiencing anything like that in any of the churches that I've attended.
The modern church, A, because of its traditions, but B, because just the lack of time that we spend with those communities, typically outside of a worship service, is not a conducive place to where we can explore story. I mean, Zach, basically, we talked about story in two ways. Zach primarily works in organizations communicating how their ministry has impacted people's stories. Like, how does that get told to other people? And what he's saying is less than 1% of all church communication worldwide has anything to do with actually how Jesus is impacting somebody's life. It's an extraordinary statistic. Soil and Roots approaches story from acknowledging and exploring the importance of our personal stories and understanding our own hearts as we seek to become more like Jesus. That they're two aspects of the same thing. But I think whether you look at it from a mass marketing standpoint or from an individual spiritual formation standpoint, the problem is the same, which is we live in a culture which embraces story in Hollywood, in media, in music, in TV shows, in the videos we consume on YouTube, but we don't embrace or acknowledge story inside the church. I think the evidence of that is crystal clear. Probably because right now the emphasis is so pastor leader centric. The point of go to church is to be bestowed some kind of higher knowledge by our pastor, and we're not even given the opportunity to explore or wrestle with that information with him or with leadership. This is what the Bible says. You've been taught, you've been lectured to. We'll see you next week. Maybe you get to ask a few questions in a Bible study or a small group. Probably not. So there's certainly an aura, an atmosphere in most churches that is anti-story. That's not what we're here to do. So I think it's a tremendous concern that Zach is raising from a mass marketing standpoint. And the reason that his organization and Soil and Roots see the world so similarly is that he's approaching it from that standpoint. And Soil and Roots is saying, hey, look, if we really want to become more like Jesus, we have to dig into our own stories. It's embedded in human nature to be able to do that.
Coming at it from a creative writing standpoint, I think the idea of the author that has developed, especially post-Enlightenment, is this kind of ivory tower perception that you have one writer up in a room somewhere clanking away at a typewriter, producing an incredible masterpiece that they then bring to the world, the audience, and they receive it. We have the creator and the audience. And the truth about storytelling is that it's much more deeply collaborative, particularly depending on which model of storytelling you're following. So I thought it was fascinating that Zach was diving into this idea that we are shifting to be more of an oral culture where our traditions and our stories are related directly to each other, because so much of our other communication is visual. So I think that's fascinating, because what that implies is that our stories need to be more collaborative. They need to be more interactive. We are telling these stories together. We are in a shared space. We are part of a vast network, a web of stories that are being told together. And that's a very different idea from following a specific script that one authority in the ivory tower or wherever has created and then handed down to the rest of us to read or consume or follow. And it's a very different model. One of the things that I appreciated about the conversation with Zach is that he emphasized story in the sense of a multiplicity of stories, that each of us have not just one story, meaning our specific transformational salvation experience, which is a powerful story and should certainly be told, but that each of us have this endless array of stories that we could draw from for times that God has shown up and been with us and has led us. Zach said we have to lead with story like Christ did. He led with it and then followed up with more instructional training. He followed up with the specifics of the kingdom or what we must do to be saved, but he rarely led with that. He led with story. So how would you feel that we can imitate that? What would that look like in our lives, not just in our church spaces, but in our homes, with our marriages, with our children? What does it look like to follow Christ and lead with story?
I think it's what Kyle alluded to. In the greenhouse that we're a part of, one of the 4 rhythms that we practice every week as a group, in our case of 8 people, is answering the question, how's it going with your soul? And it's pulled right from John Wesley in the early Methodist Church. I'm not Methodist, but I have been intrigued by how the Methodist Church exploded in the West and America back in the 1800s. And every week they would have a meeting called the class meeting in somebody's home. And that was the only question that was asked. It was a small group, couple families. Somebody would come in and how's it going with your soul? Everybody got the chance to answer that. Well, that question is basically tell me your story of just that week.
Yeah.
Help me understand your life, your story, your conflict, your struggles, your joys, your celebrations from that week. And Wesley claimed it was absolutely essential to spiritual development and the growth of the church. So that's a very simple thing that anybody could do in any relationship, a marriage, a parent, a child, a greenhouse, small group. Hey, we're going to take an hour and go around and just ask the question, how's it going with your soul? I don't know about Kyle, but I have learned more about the other people in our greenhouse, despite the other 3 rhythms, which are all wonderful, just through that question. How's it going with your soul?
Well, and about myself too. And the fact that I know that that's going to be, we're going to discuss that on both days. The fact that I know that's coming makes me, for me, I'm more attuned to how God is working in my life. So I can share that. Again, it's not a pressure. It's not like, well, what did I do this week? Or it just organically comes as, okay, well, this is, I'm more aware. I'm more, it's more highlighted for me. To be able to see, oh, this is how God's working here. This is what he did. Whereas before I might have glossed right over that. I might not have even paid attention to it. But the more that I focus my energy on him and the more that I love him, like you said, Brian, the more I want to experience him and share him with other people. And it comes organically and it comes in a way that is so much more genuine and so much more heartfelt. Because I'm experiencing it in real time and I'm going through this with him and I just want to tell you about it. And to be able to share that with somebody, not only other believers, but people that I don't know their background. I don't know what they believe or what they don't believe, but they're going to see my excitement, my enthusiasm, my genuine love of Jesus just by me explaining, hey, this is what happened to me today. Or this is how I've had so many people ask me in the car, well, how's your day going? And that right there is an invitation for me to be like, you know what, I'm really struggling. I've never done that. I've never had the courage to do that, but I've been thinking about, you know what, I need to be more honest and more open because that just doing that, because other people, I've asked them, well, how are you doing? They're like, well, man, I'm just, it's been a hard day. Right there is an invitation. It's like that person is saying, please, are you going to respond to this? Are you going to talk to me about this? Or are you just going to keep going with your day? And I'm like, and I try, and I know I've failed, but I try to be, well, so what was rough about it? Or why is it hard? And they just get an opportunity to talk and to share with what they're struggling with. And
but there's some key points. There's some key points to what you're saying though. One is that you care enough about them to listen and not just give them lip service, but to actually listen.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 is that they're captive in a car. I mean, you're both making time to be able to make space for that expression of the story. That's what the greenhouse does so well. It sets a time, 45 minutes every week, just to talk through our stories and explore them together. And this is my point back to Tim's original question. Most of the modern church experience gives no space for that. The only place we typically get that is when we're really in trouble. We're in a recovery program. We're in marriage crisis. That's all of a sudden when story is supposed to be explored, but it's only in those crisis moments. And yet we miss the fact, to Zach's point from last week, that depending on how you calculate, at least 40%, maybe much more of the Bible is a narrative. And even when we talk about the gospel, Kyle, like we've had this discussion, the gospel of what? The gospel of the kingdom? The gospel of salvation? What are we talking about when we're sharing the good news? When we talk about the resurrection, does the resurrection only mean salvation from sins, or is there a bigger story that needs to be told there? Like if there is one area of modern Christianity that has yet to be explored. It would be not only God's story, but how our individual stories fit into that. And you can tell by the frustration of my voice, there's virtually no space in the modern Christian experience to include it. And it's vital to our journey to become more like Jesus.
Amen.
And sharing of those stories, as you guys have just alluded to, can be deeply raw and vulnerable. It can be uncomfortable. And maybe that's partly why space is not made for it more frequently. It can be a challenge to anyone that wants to control the narrative or the room or the space or the conversation to have those kinds of stories shared. But it's so powerful when we do give people the opportunity to engage with us, but also to see their stories as examples and narratives of God's goodness beyond just their salvation story, which they may look at and say, oh, well, that's not powerful enough. It's not a big enough story. I was never a drug addict that was set free. I love that Zach brought in Revelations 12:11, where it says, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And this ties directly to what we're talking about. I'm not a scholar of Hebrew, but I looked up the word, and I've read that the Hebrew word for testimony in the Bible is iduth, which means, roughly translated, do it again with the same power and authority. That was the Hebrew, as I understand it, perception of what testimony meant. It was not just this kind of legal term that we see it as providing evidence, but almost a call upon God to remind ourselves and him to do it again with the same power that you did it before. And that is through story. That is how the Israelites understood things, through that repetition, through the patterning, through reminding themselves and their children again and again, telling the same stories. We see the Bible writers using this kind of structure in their narratives of rhythm and repetition. So it's not just salvation, although that is absolutely a story we should be telling again and again and again, but it's all of his miracles. It's all of his faithfulness, his provision, his peace, his healing, the friendships he brings to our lives, the hard times he sees us through, the beauty he has revealed to us, the spouse he brought to us, the children he's given us, the deeper intimacy that he's drawing us into. When we tell those stories, we're saying, God, in your power and authority, do it again. Not just that you've delivered me from my sins, although I'll be eternally grateful for that. But when I give my testimony, it's far more than just that salvation moment. It's how God has shown up again and again and again. So what do you think about this idea that our testimony is not just our salvation story, as important as that is, but all the stories of what God has done in our lives?
I mean, Bessel van der Kolk wrote an amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score, which I heartily recommend. He's one of the, I think, leading figures in post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. And Kurt Thompson, a Christian neuroscientist, counselor, they've begun to explore this in the last 5 or 10 years. There is a scientific neurological healing that happens when we tell our stories over and over and over again, because the brain at some point needs to get reoriented to what is actually true, especially if there's trauma, hardship, relational fracture in those stories. And that happens through sharing the story, exploring the story repetitiously in some sort of space, safe, secure community. It might just be one relationship, but it's as effective, if not more so, in a safe community. This is why AA and Celebrate Recovery, that's why they work. They're meeting repetitiously to explore their hurts and their harms and their challenges in a safe space where they are accepted and can work through these things. And it actually provides synaptic changes in the brain. And I think this is such a crucial part of growing together to be like Jesus, and again, primarily missed by the modern construction of the Western church. So, it is salvation, but Zach would probably kill me for saying this, but he calls it evangelism porn. Like the only stories that we hear are salvation stories, and they have to be really, really extreme. Saved from a satanic cult, a life of drugs and alcohol, some sort of crazy addiction. And those are great stories, don't get me wrong. But, he calls it evangelism porn because it's really attractive, gets a lot of eyeballs, makes us feel good. But his point is it sends the underlying message that for those of us that either struggle to remember our stories or don't have some compelling salvation or other sort of story that our story isn't important, that it doesn't matter. And so, you know, how do we as communities, Tim, to your question, say, hey, look, whatever your journey was to come into the kingdom, that's a great story. You should tell it over and over and over again. Let's give you a chance to do that. But your sanctification stories, your stories of suffering, your stories of celebration, your stories of victory, your stories of what happened today, last week, your relational struggles, those are extraordinarily important. And for those that don't remember their stories, and there's lots of people that struggle to remember their childhood or their stories, they just don't think that way. There are actually techniques and tools and ways of helping the brain uncover those memories. This is science as well as scripture. And it has been shown time and time again that even for those that are sort of numb to their histories or even to the emotions of those histories, through certain practices that exercise the brain, the memories are there. They're not gone. It doesn't just evaporate. They might be buried under some things that can be regained, redeemed, restored through practicing your story.
To be able to provide a space where hey, I'm going to ask some hard questions. I'm going to delve into something that might be sticky or that people might look at me like, what? I mean, we all have that. We all have the stuff that we wrestle with, especially when you read the Bible. Well, for me in the Old Testament, I mean, there's so many things that I'm reading. I'm like, what, what does this mean? I'm confused. This doesn't seem to line up with this. And Michelle and I are doing this, and it's great to have a space where we know, you know what, there's not a question that I'm going to ask. She's going to be like, well, are you even a true Christian? I can't believe you would ask something like that. I mean, I just know that she knows my heart. I know her heart, and we can do that. The greenhouse is the same thing. We can come in there and ask these questions that might be a little jarring or might be a little bit, oh man, I can't believe you're thinking that. But at the same time, it's like, I know your heart. I know that you're chasing after Jesus with this. So let's talk about it. Let's allow you to wrestle with this. Wrestling is such a huge thing. And I don't think we have, to your point, Brian, I don't think we have spaces. I don't think we have places that we can wrestle. It's alluded to with like community groups or small groups or Bible studies or things like that. But in my experience, it's either I was too afraid to say it because I didn't know these people. I didn't know how they would perceive me. Or if I say this and then I just get blank stares and it's like, well, okay, well, nobody here can wrestle with this with me. So, okay, I won't be able to say stuff like this anymore. So safety is a huge thing that I'm picking up on all of that, and to be able to provide that.
Yeah, that's good. To come at this from kind of a different angle as well, when we look at Christ as the greatest storyteller, his favorite story form was the parable. And parables are a simple story with human characters that are meant to illustrate a spiritual lesson. He told stories as a way for us to better understand the kingdom, better understand God and his heart toward us. I have to geek out on another word here. The word parable actually shares in its word history with the Greek word that parabola comes from, the intersection of a cone with a parallel plane. And both of those come from the Greek for placing side by side. The shape of a parabola, like in a bowl or a cone or a pop fly ball, comes from the two shapes being placed side by side. If you have a story, you're not going to really understand it unless you place it side by side against the greater spiritual truth that the Lord is revealing through that narrative. In his wonderful book, Scribbling in the Sand, Christ and Creativity, Michael Card writes that we should understand our own lives as parables. He writes, quote, "The Bible gives abundant examples of people's lives that were in fact living parables. Abraham offering his son to God, a parable of God offering his own son for us. Jacob wrestling with God, a parable of the struggle we all have in finding faith. Job suffering, a parable about the truth that God doesn't always give us answers, but he always gives us himself. Listening to the parables of Jesus will teach us how to listen to the parables of our own lives. And the best way to learn to listen to the parable of your life is to examine the parables of Jesus and learn how to first listen to them." end quote. I want to ask if you resonate with that, this idea of seeing ourselves as characters in a story, of understanding the stories that happen to us as potentially parables that the Lord is telling, that maybe not in the sense of a didactic, moralistic fairy tale where the whole point of the story is for us to learn a lesson, but an opportunity for us to understand a part of God and his kingdom or his heart toward us as we go through the stories of our lives. Does that resonate with you?
I have so many thoughts on this, and all of them will probably result in emails from listeners and viewers. So this week, if you have a comment on the episode, the proper email is Kyle
Yes.
at soilandroots.org.
Yep.
Kyle
Please.
at soilandroots.org. Just so we get that down.
KYLE.
Look, I think there's KYLE at soilandroots.org. If you have a complaint or you have a vehement problem with something that we've shared,
please let me know.
Look, I think there's an underlying idea set here at work in modern Christianity that makes Michael Card's quote hard for some people. I'll see if I can unpack this well. First of all, as we mentioned, church tends to be fairly non-participatory, meaning we're worshiping God through music and we're listening to a sermon. But in terms of interacting with the community and interacting with God or interacting with the pastor, unless you go to a small church that has a real tight community, and many of you do because you've emailed me, we don't even realize what we're missing. We don't even realize that's part of the deal. We go to an event, and most church services are an event. In some cases, they're a show, and we just watch and we get a nice message and we leave. And in the church we used to go to, like, they had to shuttle people in and out because they had multiple services. Like, it's not even intended to build community or a place to share a story. You supposedly get that in the small groups, but there's many Christian thinkers who think the small group effort, by and large, has been relative failure in the West. So we don't even create an environment where, even if we knew how to look at the parables of Jesus and relate them to our own lives, that we have a venue to do that. On top of that, many, many people, because of their specific tradition or however they were introduced to the church and to Jesus, believe that to explore their own story is sinful. It's selfish. We're supposed to keep our eyes on Jesus. We're supposed to die to ourselves. We're supposed to take up our cross and follow him, all of which are fine Bible passages. But the underlying idea that develops from that, truthfully, especially then if you've been raised or you've been introduced in a way where the sin salvation message is like the only thing you ever hear, is that we're dirty, rotten sinners who need to keep our eyes on Jesus. Therefore, whatever our internal struggles are, just contribute to that sense of worthlessness. We recognize our sin, we recognize our dirtiness, we recognize our need to be cleansed. But if we don't hear other parts of that story, the idea that we're going to come away with is, I'm worthless. I'm worthless. My value is less because of my sin. Sin is not a value judgment. It's a relationship challenge. So I think there's a couple factors here at work. You just have the expectation that we don't go to church to share our stories because we go to church to have an event. And if, depending on our tradition, the idea that we get month after month, week after week is, my story is not even worth telling. It's not worth exploring. And if I do it, that means that I'm being selfish and I don't even have my eyes on Jesus. And that just makes me feel worse. And I think those are two very powerful assumptions that work against what Card was saying. I think he's right, but I've never seen that practiced in a church. I'm sure it is, but in my experience, and to be honest, I've never connected with anybody who said that that's been their church experience either.
Yeah, I think that although this certainly doesn't apply, I'm sure, to every church, there are many churches where hopefully this kind of model is embraced. But too often, if something threatens the peace or threatens to bring in tension or conflict or trouble of any sort, which dialogue and interactivity and questioning and even storytelling with its raw vulnerability can tend to do, that can be discouraged because we want everything to be polished and impressive and to be appealing to guests and to feel like we have our act all together, which is probably a natural human instinct. But conflict is necessary. Conflict is vital to growth. Zach brought in that great quote from Robert McKee, who is huge in the space of screenwriting, who defined story, Zach said, as conflict changes life. Without conflict, there is no story. Since we're diving deep into storytelling today, well, that's a truism in creative writing. If you go to the park and you have a nice picnic and you eat a sandwich and come home, that's a nice diary entry, but it's not a story. Now, if you go to the park for a picnic and a bear attacks and it carries off your sandwich and you chase it through the woods because it was a PBJ made with jam by your dying granny whose wish was that you would enjoy it, and you chase the bear up a tree and fight it at the top of the highest branch to get your sandwich back, now we have a story, right? For a story, we need conflict. It's vital. Conflict changes life, you said. So we need conflict, but we also need change. This is another truism in fiction writing as well. If the protagonist doesn't change over the course of the story, he or she is flat, shallow, cardboard, not an interesting character. So conflict changes us. We need conflict and we need change. And both of those things are scary. I think not coincidentally, two of the things that human beings struggle with the most are conflict and change. So should we be surprised when our lives, our stories are in fact full of conflict and change? Should we resist those moments of conflict and change, realizing that they are the very things necessary for our growth and development, for our stories to be told? How else could God tell our stories? How else could something happen worth telling? How else could we grow? So do you think that we tend to resist conflict and change when sometimes perhaps we should be pressing into them?
Yes, and yes. But because we nobody wants those things, right? I mean, Jonah
Right.
didn't want to be thrown into the ocean, and John the Baptist didn't want to be thrown in prison. And we have story after story. The reality is the grand narrative of Scripture contains those same elements. You have conflict introduced 3 chapters in to the Bible that takes the rest of the Scriptures up until Revelation 22 to resolve. But depending on which country we live in, and Soil and Roots is read and listened to in different cultures, but we, at least here in this part of the world, if we have a headache, we're going to take some Tylenol. If we have, the flu, we're going to there is a medicine, a panacea for every physical ailment we could think of. If we're emotionally hurting, either we're going to suck it up and press through it and numb ourselves through all sorts of distractions or work or service in the church or whatever, or we do the hard work of seeking good counsel. And usually that's a last resort, right? We typically don't go to a counselor unless everything else has failed. At least that's what my counselor friends have told me. So, we live. I don't want to use the word soft, but it's probably the right word compared to previous generations who struggled to put food on the table physically because they had to farm it themselves or go shoot it themselves, whose days looked very differently than they did 200 years ago. The pace of the day, the activities of the day looked entirely different than what we have now. I mean, we don't sit around wondering how we're going to grow our food. We run to Walmart and get what we want. We live in extraordinary comfort and ease compared to previous generations. I think this idea that our growth in Jesus is, I would argue, primarily accomplished through conflict and change. It just bucks against the ideas that drive we're supposed to be pleasant. We're supposed to have our needs met. We're supposed to get everything we want within 5 minutes. We're supposed to be able to choose programming through 15 different streaming services instantly. Like, we're constantly fighting instant gratification and the removal of pain, except that human beings are primarily changed through that sort of conflict. I think you're hitting on one of the core challenges in modern discipleship, but it's hidden. It's unconscious. I'm not sure how many people are doing thinking and writing on it, but I think it's pretty pervasive. Now, we're not masochists. We're not running around trying to find suffering, but when it comes, I'll speak for myself. I don't like it. I'll do anything to avoid it. I've certainly tried to anesthetize it. And yet, if I have to go back and be honest, my journey to become more like Jesus has been far more accelerated through suffering than it has through times of peace. Even if those times of peace include great times of prayer and scripture, And again, that might be controversial, but I think I told you the story I wrote about this week on Substack. A pastor met with me a few months ago. He said, "Oh, what's been the most formative element in your life?" And he was fully expecting me to say the Bible. And I said, "Suffering, bar none. Suffering has been the most formative aspect of my life."
Absolutely, because suffering and conflict for me have taken me to the end of myself for what I thought I was capable of handling or doing. And then Jesus shows up and shows me, you know what? No. I constantly think about that Stretch Armstrong doll. When I was a kid, the Stretch Armstrong, you could just stretch him all the way out. The commercials where you could stretch him all over the place.
I broke one of those.
You did?
I did. I split him up. I tore his arm off. Yeah.
You just had to throw in how you were just so awesome and strong that you were the only person in the history of the world that ripped a Stretch Armstrong.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep. No, it was old.
Hercules.
It was old and decrepit. Hercules.
But yeah, so I see it as God knows how far my Stretch Armstrong will go before it breaks. Like, I'm Stretch Armstrong. He knows how to do it. He knows that I'm going to go from here to wherever. So when conflict comes, I feel like this is as far as I can stretch. This is it. I can't go any further. This suffering is all I can handle. And God's like, "Oh, Kyle, I can take you all the way down to the end over here. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take you just to here. And I'm going to let you know that you thought it was here. I'm going to take you here. And now you know that, I've gone here. The next time when conflict and suffering come, that's it. I can't go any further. Nope. I'm going to take you a little bit over here." And again, he's not doing it. Like you said, it's not masochism. It's not, I just love this pain. No, it's a realization of the truth that God knows what he's doing in my life. And he is bringing this conflict and suffering to me to get me to the place where he knows I can be. And he's constantly stretching me in good ways and in ways that are bringing me closer to him.
To pivot a bit, in the last episode, Zach said that when we talk about storytelling, our application and understanding of it tends to be very slim, very narrow. But as you guys discussed, we're all on this ongoing journey of sanctification, and that can get really messy, right? As Christ calls us to adventure, to lay down parts of ourselves, we live through 1,000 variations of that hero's journey that he talks about. I think we can tend to see our lives as 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. At least speaking for myself, things seem to be going great, and then they fall apart. We keep trying to get it all together, but we keep failing. I might ask, when am I ever going to arrive? When am I going to reach success? When do I get there? When do I reach the prize, the goal? I think this is part of the so-called American dream, the rags to riches, self-made, do-it-yourself moxie that requires this linear progression upward. So we can tend to think of our lives that they need to either keep improving, getting better by the world standards, or something is wrong. But is that biblical? Do things always get better by the world standards in the lives of God's people? So I wanted to ask you guys, how can we shake ourselves loose, particularly here in the West, from this idea that our story needs to look like upward mobility, and instead better glimpse the story that God is telling, maybe through adversity, maybe even, as you mentioned before, Brian, through suffering?
Progress is a very powerful idea in modern times. We live in the assumption that our 401ks are going to grow, that technology is going to get better.
What's a 401k? What is that? I'm not familiar with that.
You're a teacher. You don't need one of those.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. All right. Good.
403b. Do you know what that is?
$400. Is it $400? I think I might have that in savings. I don't know.
Well, in that case, you have a 403b. You're in good shape.
Okay, good. Great.
There's this idea, though, that we assume things are always improving, and that, we watch movie after movie where there's always a happy ending and the victor always wins. Like, we're trained pretty early on that progress is assumed, but that idea, that assumption, that cultural assumption, is fairly modern. It's fairly new. If you went back even a few hundred years into different cultures around the world today, that's not an assumption at all. It has a profound effect on how we view life, at least here in the West. And is it I don't think it's anti-biblical per se, but I wouldn't call it a universal truth. It can't be, because there's also so much reversion at times. Even in the West, you could argue, well, technology might be improving, but we're also using that technology to form new ways to harm and kill each other. And if technology is improving and the economy is improving, is the moral condition of certain countries improving? Like, it doesn't move. Things don't move in lockstep like that. Typically, you see things going forward and things going backward as civilization moves onward. So I think it definitely contributes to our lack of understanding and lack of acceptance of suffering and trial, because we've been trained from birth, our society's been trained from birth that, oh, things are just going to get better no matter what, and eventually I'm going to retire to the villages and golf for the last 20 years of my life, when that's not normally how life goes.
Yeah, that's great. And the more that we can share with each other these stories, whether we're going through wonderful times of joy or the times of difficulty and sorrow, the tribulations, the trials and hardships, the more we can share with each other those stories openly, vulnerably, in a raw, transparent way, the more that we can see, okay, I'm not alone in this. We can fight against that lie that tells us that if things aren't perfect in our life, that God must not be pleased with us, or we must have done something wrong. And so stories can function so profoundly in that way, in that community space. Zach mentioned that training and equipping is crucial and needs to be consistent to be effective across all ministry models. That anything you look at, training is important, that practicing of what you're going to do. And Brian, you brought up the idea, I think, that perhaps storytelling should be a Christian habit that we are taught and trained on, like other spiritual disciplines. Any other thoughts that either of you have on that?
That would be really cool to see where that would go and how we could train ourselves on storytelling, what that would look like. I would be that's very exciting to kind of explore that with a group of people who are willing to walk into that space and see, hey, how could we improve our storytelling? What would that even look like? How could we sharpen each other on that? Now, I know, Brian, you mentioned that. Did you have any concrete ideas, or had you been thinking about, oh, this is what that would look like, or how that would function in a greenhouse or in a home church or something like that?
No, actually, my conversation with Zach prompted it. I had never thought of storytelling as a spiritual discipline. I think there's probably an unlimited amount of spiritual disciplines just because the Spirit himself is so creative. I'm really intrigued by it. I think the lack of it being noted as a discipline, I've not seen it in print, and I've not heard about it being practiced. It probably is somewhere. But it's interesting as to why that wouldn't be the case, considering the Bible is a story and has so many stories in it that are so memorable. I tend to think that we've talked about this before. We live in a hyper intellectualized environment. We assume that our formation occurs primarily through the intake of information. As long as we know the right biblical facts, as long as our theology is accurate, then that's what's most important, versus becoming like someone. And if we agree that story is formative, and I think we've all been formed by stories, our own stories and movies we've seen and books we've read and people that we've interacted with who've shared powerful stories. To me, it's remarkable that storytelling isn't, hey, this is a Sunday school thing we teach our kids, because it's so important to development. Again, I think it's primarily not in the church because we've hyper intellectualized our faith. But if you look at other major formative experiences, you see story playing, very, very prominent roles, whether it's marriage or college or military or sports teams. I mean, how often do you hear coaches, as a means of motivating and forming their players, sharing story after story after? I mean, it's commonplace in most formative experiences, but in Christianity, we tend to boil it down. We've reduced it to, well, all you need is to have the right set of beliefs or the right set of ecstatic experiences, I think both of which miss the mark.
It reminds me of, again, going back to fiction writing, that there's a distinction made between plot and story. So the plot is the sequence of events this happens, then this leads to this, then this happens, then this happens, and it finishes with this. But the story encompasses the plot, but it's the broader narrative. It's understanding the overall context, figuring out the themes, the motivations, the overall point that the story itself is trying to make. So I think in some ways we have kept the plot. We know this happens, this happens, this happens, but it's easy to miss that overall story, to miss the grand narrative that's unfolding, both in a reductionist understanding of the gospel itself, where, we aren't arguing about whether Jesus came and died on the cross, but we're missing the grand narrative of the cosmic restoration of all things, or in our own lives, to see them as a sequence of events. Oh, I look back, this happened in my past, this is happening now, this will probably happen in my future, without telling the story in a way that, by sharing it with others, by understanding the context, by seeing how it fits into this narrative that God is telling, we can see the themes, we can see the meaning, we can see the parable, we can see the revelation of truth about himself that God is perhaps imparting to us through the stories that we're living. We focus too much on the plot and miss the story. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, you know what? I had a powerful experience with this yesterday. It's remarkable that you made that comment. I'm reading a book, which I won't name, written by a famous Christian church planner. And he writes in one of the first few chapters that Jesus Christ no longer has flesh and blood, and that he has no nationality, meaning different cultures may perceive Jesus differently. And that's because Jesus is sort of now the omni-man, not even a man. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, wait a second. You've made two drastic theological, unsubstantiated claims that have removed the narrative of the Bible. Meaning, in your effort to get people saved, you have made the claim that Jesus is no longer human. I'm dumbfounded that made its way into a book. And that he's no longer Jewish. I mean, in one sense, obviously Jesus is for anyone who comes to him by faith, but you've destroyed both his humanity, which is essential to understanding who Jesus and God is, and you've removed the whole beautiful message and the role of the people of Israel in the Old Testament and on through modern times. So I was just like, you are so myopic that all that you care about is somebody saying a prayer of salvation without even understanding the context in which that happens, the role of discipleship and the role of the kingdom. And these comments were written in such a way that, everybody knows that. I was stunned at the reductionist nature, and the fact that you just brought it up amazes me. But yes, there's a very present example from less than 24 hours ago.
Zach brought up Robert McKee. I'll mention him again. I found another quote from his. He wrote, "Stories are equipment for living." John Eldredge writes, "Story is how we figure things out. Story is the language of the heart. Stories shed light on our lives." Or as C.S. Lewis writes in the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, "All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before." Since we've been talking about story so much, I think maybe it's appropriate to tell a story. At my house, we've been watching the Olympics, and it reminds me of one of the most powerful moments in sporting history, which happened at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. This story may very well be familiar to you, and apologies in advance if I start bawling like a baby. This gets me every time.
I'm probably going to be right there with you. So
I'll just laugh at you both.
Yeah, I figured. So in 1992, runner Derek Redmond was competing in the 400-meter sprint. By this point, he had undergone 5 operations, including one in his Achilles tendon less than 4 months before the Olympic Games began. He later shared that as he settled into the blocks for the start of the semifinal race, his thoughts went to his father, Jim, who had given him so much support and was watching now from the stands. Derek got off to a clean start and was running smoothly when, about 150 meters into the race, his right hamstring muscle tore and he fell to the ground in agony. When he saw the stretcher bearers rushing towards him, he waved them away and kept hobbling forward in terrible pain with 250 meters to go, determined to finish his race. His father jumped up out of the stands, ran onto the track, and put an arm around his son. He supported him, and hand in hand, with his son sobbing, they continued all the way around the track, step after painful step, his father holding him up. Just before the finish line, the father stayed close but let go of his son, and Derek completed the final steps on his own as the crowd of 65,000 people shot to their feet for a standing ovation. If I want my children to understand what Paul means in Scripture when he talks about running our race and finishing well, and our loving Father who will hold us up when we can't make it alone, and the great cloud of witnesses described in Hebrews, I can tell my kids this story. That is what our Heavenly Father does for us when we press on toward the prize for which we have been called in Christ Jesus. And we all have stories of our Father to share.
Great way to close the program. Thanks, Tim.
Man.
Kyle, you okay?
No, but it's a good not okay. So,
hey, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you in the audience, whether you're watching or listening or reading. Again, if you have a complaint, send it to Kyle at soilandroots.org.
Yes.
If you'd like more information on us, you can just check out the website at soilandroots.org. If you want to find us on social media, if you're looking at Facebook or Instagram, you can find us at Soil and Roots Podcast. And if you're on YouTube or Substack, you can find us at just Soil and Roots. If you'd love to support our work financially around the world as we seek to make deep disciples and join with communities all over this great planet, you can do so securely and safely at soilandroots.org. Soil and Roots Podcast is produced in-house by our team here, most notably my son, Zach, who helps out. He also provides the music. You can check him out at Fishu on Spotify. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.